Okay, so you right now are viewing part two of our 6.1 Google slide deck. If you have not yet viewed part one, then stop this, go watch part one first, and meet me back here for part two of 6.1. We were finishing up question three, African American culture. Last thing I'm going to say on that is that even though there wasn't full out rebellions all that often with death and, trying to injure whites, they did rebel in small ways in their own way. People would purposely complete tasks wrong. They would pretend like they didn't understand the directions they were being given. They would purposely work slowly. They would sabotage tools or crops or a product that the master was trying to make, that sort of thing. So, they did try to fight back in their own way over time. All right, so if you need more time, push pause, because here we go. Draw a line underneath everything you just wrote. And of course, we got some video clips for you on some stuff about Southern culture, some examples of spiritual songs and things. Because yeah, the other thing, FYI, hint, hint, wink, wink, should have brought this one up, sorry, is so music's really important, and one type of song that becomes embedded in their culture were specifically called spirituals. And they're called spirituals more for the spirit of staying alive and community and together, not necessarily because they were all religious, okay? But spirituals were often secret codes that they would sing, sending people directions about how to get from point A to point B on the Underground Railroad, or trying to spread news about a family member from one plantation to another because the songs would spread over time. Especially giving directions about escaping, or when a conductor for the railroad was going to be at a particular spot to try to escape, those kind of things. So they would send secret coded messages in these special type of songs called spirituals. Okay, so be familiar with those songs. Those were some of the most important types of songs coming out of culture at that time for slaves. Okay, and of course, again, here's some examples for you guys that you can watch if you wish. And here we go, Q4, write it down, highlight it yellow, Nat Turner. Okay, if you guys were able to watch Roots the year that you're viewing this video, Nat Turner has a rebellion, and it covers that in Roots. Okay, so Nat Turner is an African-American slave. He felt that the way to try to escape slavery was to rebel in a violent way. Not all slaves agreed, but Nat Turner got a lot of slaves on his side, and him with several others go out one night with weapons and kill several white families, everyone, babies, women, children, pregnant people, men. Okay, no matter who you were, if you were white and you lived on a plantation in the range of this rebellion, you could be victim to the black slaves who were rebelling. Okay, so this is one of the most famous rebellions to come out of that time. There was about 250 rebellions during the whole time slavery existed in the South that were a thing. But really, if you think about millions and millions of people being enslaved over a few hundred years before we outlaw slavery, 250 rebellions is not really that many, actually. So they were pretty rare. Nat Turner's is one of the bigger and well-known ones because they actually managed to kill quite a few white families. However, of course, eventually Turner is found, and he is given really what is a mock trial. It's not a fair trial. They assume he's guilty from step one, but they go through the pomp and circumstance of a pretend trial, and he's eventually hung for starting that rebellion. What ultimately ends up happening, though, is was it worth it? Was it not worth it? Does it really change anything? That's an opinion question, because what happens is all of the white owners all throughout the South, even if you were nowhere near Nat Turner's rebellion, want to send a message to their black slaves: you better not be pulling a Nat Turner. And so anyone stepped one little toe out of line or did anything wrong, and they could be instantly lynched, which is being hung by the neck, or get more severely beaten, or a worse punishment than they normally would have for like a small offense, because they really wanted to make sure that the slaves were staying in line. So hundreds of blacks end up being killed by whites out of revenge and anger, and just to for the charade of showing the rest of their slaves, if you rebel, this is what will happen to you, and pick some innocent slave who hadn't done anything and kill them on the spot, just to show, keep that fear factor going, to keep control of the African American population. Okay. Ultimately, another thing that happens out of this is, remember one of the questions, a couple questions back, talked about slave codes. Well, those slave codes became even greater in number and even more strict about what African Americans were and were not allowed to do, even if you were a free black in the South. It really limited their rights. So did it make a statement? Yes. Did it get a lot of national attention? Yes. Does it probably add abolitionists to the abolitionist movement? Yes. So did Nat Turner's Rebellion do positive things? You could argue yes, but does it also do a lot of negative things? You could argue yes. And was violence the answer? That's an opinion question. So Nat Turner's Rebellion, kind of an interesting topic. So give yourself a question on the left-hand side. Okay, highlight, 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 and draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. If you need more time, push pause. Here we go. Of course, I got some on Nat Turner for you and his Rebellion. So again, these are optional. I'd recommend picking and choosing some here and there, you guys, and watch some of those to help you understand the material better. Okay, well, what about free African Americans? This is an FYI. You don't have to write this down on your notes, but just for you to kind of be aware, because not every single black person in the United States was a slave. There were free blacks. How did they become free? Well, typically they either were granted freedom by their owner, or over time through side jobs, or a nice owner who would let them have a wage of some sort would save up enough money to buy their freedom. Even if you were a free African American, though, you were not a citizen of the U.S. You still had racism, even if you lived in the North. Don't think that the North treated everyone equally. Even in the North, there was a lot of racism towards the black community. Okay. Sometimes, though, if you were free, you were able to own land or a home, or maybe even start a business. The very first female millionaire ever in the United States was actually a black woman who does a hair care line for African Americans, but that's not until after the Civil War and slavery had ended. So some blacks, free blacks, will even go on to own their own slaves because they have enough land. They need some help labor-wise with farming and stuff. They're often forbidden to go into a lot of public places, or had to use a separate entrance or separate hours than white people would have to use. A lot of discrimination, like I said. They're not allowed to vote. They can't give testimony in court. They typically could not meet freely in large groups without white people being present. Often there were curfews in effect through many states, even if you were free. Okay, and sometimes you were not even allowed to enter into a state at all if you were black and free, because you didn't want ideas getting into the slaves' heads about these free blacks that were in the country. All right, so there's a little information for you about free African Americans. Moving on to Q5, write that down. Southern economy, highlighted yellow. All right, so Southern economy, you guys should know this by now. This is super big time review from like day one. Their economy is based on slavery and agriculture. Remember in the beginning it was tobacco, and as time has moved on, it's become cotton as the big cash crop. Okay, so Southern economy, slavery, agriculture, and agriculture, remember, is farming, and mostly their big cash crop is cotton. Okay, because of these big sprawled out plantations, they almost acted like their own little cities. Some of them would have churches. They'd grow enough food to have food right there. You'd have slaves sew, your clothing and make baskets and, pottery and stuff for you. So there's not a ton of large cities in the South. They do exist. There are cities in the South, but there's less than how many cities, larger cities, exist in the North. This matters because it's going to be important during the Civil War. So pay attention to this, okay? So the South, they don't have as many big cities. All right. They also have a lot less railroad because they're not transporting created goods all over the place to different cities or throughout different, states, right? They're creating raw material products that just get shipped out, and that's it. So they have less railroad. That's going to come into play. Do they have railroad track? Yes, but it's less than the North. They have less telegraph line because, again, they don't have as many factories and businesses. They don't have as many big cities and stuff. So that will come into play during the Civil War. All right. So a lot of life just on farmland, on small and big farms and plantations. Remember, the South opposes tariffs. That's going to be coming into play with the Civil War stuff. They don't like that tax that, for incoming goods from other places, getting that tariff tax on them. It's hurting the Southern economy and their trade agreements, selling their cotton off to Europe and stuff. Okay. The South truly, oh, look, there's something misspelled there on your slide. See if you can find it. The South truly saw the abolition movement as an attack on their entire way of life, because if abolitionists got their way and they ended slavery, in the Southern person's mind, you are going to collapse the Southern economy. Because how could we go from having all of this free labor to end up having to pay everybody a wage and have working hours and not be able to have our farms running almost 24/7. The Southerners could not imagine their way of life surviving or functioning if slavery were to disappear. So the North at this point, leading up to the Civil War in the mid-1800s, is truly, they're looking at the North like, you're my enemy because you're not my friend, right? You're not on board with how we want to live. And the South justified their behavior with slaves because really they would look at the North with all the factories and the immigrant workers who would work in the factories for really low wages. And a lot of them were living in the slums and in tenement housing, and the conditions were really horrific. There weren't safety or health regulations in place yet in most places. There was no such thing as a minimum wage. I mean, they were treated really horribly in a lot of industries in the North. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so the South was like, how is it any different? I mean, yeah, you're paying them, but you're not really paying them enough to live on. And, we provide housing and food for our slaves. And so it balances out. It's the same thing, just called something different. And that was how the South justified their treatment and behavior of slavery. They really kind of felt like the North was behaving in the same manner towards their immigrant workers, and huge communities of those immigrant workers not being treated fairly. Okay, so what started to happen, you guys, is sectionalism. Keyword there, sectionalism is going to start taking place, and you're going to have people becoming loyal to the North and their values of pro-tariffs and pro-industry and pro-immigration, okay? And then you're going to have a section break off and be really more loyal to the Southern way of life, pro-agriculture, pro-anti-tariffs, pro-slavery. And so the North and the South really are going to start pulling more and more away from each other. All right, draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. Here we go. Okay, FYI, you know how to write this down. Just remember, we went over this before, but you need to know this for the next thing to make sense. So Missouri Compromise review. Remember back in the 1820s, Missouri wanted to become a slave state. But the problem was, if we let Missouri in as a slave state, the number of states in Congress, free versus slave, will be unequal. And that would cause a power problem struggle. And so ultimately, Henry Clay came up with the Missouri Compromise. Is this ringing a bell, hopefully? Okay, and the Missouri Compromise was, hey, Maine, which has been part of Massachusetts this whole time, has been wanting to break away and become a state. Let's let Maine in as a free state at the same time that we let Missouri in as a slave state, and that will maintain the balance of power. So if you remember that, you need to understand that moving forward. Remember that they took Missouri and they drew a line underneath it. And they said, moving forward, any territory that becomes a state, if you exist below the line, you can become a slave state if you want. But if you exist above the line, and if you look at the picture on the map, there's the red line there. If you exist above that line, then you can't be a slave state. Okay, so remember that was the rule, okay? Because that rule is going to get thrown out the window here in a minute. Okay, so again, there's a video link on Missouri Compromise. If you still are like, wait, I don't totally remember, she went kind of fast, check out that video clip if you need to. Okay, And I'm not going to start the next section here because you're going to have a part 3 to these notes. Part 3 will be the last part, so come view me in part 3 when you're ready to go. I'll see you then.